Good afternoon. So good to have all of you here. Before we begin, I just want to announce that should there an emergency arise, there is an additional emergency exit at the bottom of this stairwell located behind the screen to my right. All right. All right, so let me say an official welcome to our annual fall lecture. My name is Lucy Wilkins, and I'm the Director of University Collections and Lee Chapel and Museum. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the building of what became Lee Chapel. Our commemoration of this event actually began last fall with the opening of the exhibit downstairs entitled 150 Years Later, The Heart of the Campus, which was curated by Pat Hobbs. This exhibit features the actual plans and plan book used to design the chapel. In the special collections foyer of the library, there is another exhibit. This one is on the 1920s controversy that erupted over President Smith's plans to replace the chapel with a new building. This exhibit was curated by Byron Faley. Some of the plans that were proposed for that in the 1920s are quite astounding, including one enlargement of the building that would have taken it all the way to Jefferson Street. So we do hope that you'll take some time to visit both of these exhibits and see these original documents. Our speaker today couldn't be more appropriate for this occasion. Many of you know him as he is no stranger to Lexington. The Reverend Dr. R. David Cox is currently a professor of history at Southern Virginia University and has taught history there since 2006. Dr. Cox began his professional life in the ministry. I'm so used to calling him David, that's why I'm just tripping over Cox. Dr. Cox began his professional life in the ministry. He was ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1972. After serving parishes in Connecticut, he returned to Virginia in 1987 to become the rector of R.E. Lee Episcopal Church in Lexington, now Grace Episcopal. In 2000, he completed his doctoral studies, for which he received fellowships at Harvard Divinity School and Virginia Theological Seminary. He then served congregations in Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hot Springs. He ran for Virginia's House of Delegates in 2005, for the State Senate in 2007, and was elected to the Lexington City Council in 2008, where he served a 4-year term. He graduated from 2 programs of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership at the University of Virginia. The Southern Virginia chapter of Phi Kappa Phi named him Professor of the Year this year in 2018. His book, The Religious Life of Robert E. Lee, was published in March 2017. He has published books on marriage and ministry, presented historical papers at the Virginia Forum, and written regularly for newspapers and magazines. He and his wife, Melissa, live here in Lexington and have 3 children, 4 grandchildren. Well, I understand we're all at the house this weekend, and, of course, 1 precocious dog. Professor Cox is the author of Lee Chapel at 150, A History, published just this past April to coincide with this 150th anniversary. Just so you know what it looks like, we have them on sale in the museum shop downstairs. In 2013, David came to my office, and we discovered we had a mutually inspired idea. I had discovered that the only book we had that was focused solely on Lee Chapel had been published in 2005 and was largely anecdotal and did not include any of our current permanent exhibit, Educating to Build and Rebuild America. I was looking ahead to the 150th anniversary and was searching for someone to write a new history. David, in doing research for The Religious Life, had discovered the lack of a true history of Lee Chapel on his own. He came to my office to float the idea of writing such a history. It was truly a match made in heaven. Neither one of us had any idea at the time of how important this book would become to the university and the community at large. It has already become an important resource as the university looks for direction along this journey into the future. David will be speaking today on the themes to be found in Lee Chapel at 150. Thank you, David, for your diligent work and for joining us today. We all are looking forward to hearing you speak on Lee Chapel, Redefining a Symbol. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. When we talked several years ago, we didn't realize what a mammoth project it was going to turn out to be, not to mention a certain timeliness that it may have. But I'm very grateful to Lucy and indeed all the chapel staff for their help in my researching and producing this book, for Tom Camden and the folks at Special Collections who are utterly invaluable, and Byron Fadley happens to be both. So special shout out to Byron. As well, I'm kind of grateful for the News Gazette, shall we say, for rather more of a story than I thought it was going to be. And also President Dudley, who surprised me, shall we say, in his commencement address by citing the book and doing a really very fine summary. So I appreciate all of you coming, and I notice a number of people from around about, including Southern Virginia, and those students who are here, make sure you get back for your 1:30 classes. There's a certain poignance about this too, on two levels. One is that I have Pamela Hemingway Simpson very much in mind. She was a dear friend whose love for architectural history and for this university was an ongoing inspiration as I was doing this work. And as well, she had done some study of her own on the chapel that was especially important. And the other poignancy is that to stand in this particular spot at this particular lectern, one that has figured prominently in many addresses over the last 150 years. It was from here that my predecessor, as rector of the Episcopal Church, read the burial office he first of all, William Nelson Pendleton, he gave the dedicatory address for the dedication of the chapel itself, which the local newspaper described as entertaining as it was profound and well considered, which surprised me because if you've ever seen pictures of William Nelson Pendleton, he does not look like a very entertaining figure. But he then led the burial office for Lee at the time of his funeral. Just months later, Jubal Early began from here to outline the precepts of the lost cause. From here in 1907, on the centenary of Lee's birth, the Yankee Charles Francis Adams gave a Northern seal of approval to Lee as a Confederate and as an American national hero. His plaque is up there by the organ. From here, on remembrances of Lee's death, distinguished historians have sometimes reflected and sometimes shaped evolving understandings of Lee and therefore also of the chapel itself. In its sesquicentennial year, I dare to attempt the same for our time and to do so by returning to its beginnings. June 1866. Scars of war still abounded across the South, certainly in Virginia, and definitely in Lexington. VMI's barracks remained a burned-out hulk. So did Governor John Letcher's house, the large white one just yonder. North and South, people were responding in different ways. In Tennessee, that year, Nathan Bedford Forrest was building an organization soon known as the Ku Klux Klan. In Lexington, Robert Edward Lee proposed building a chapel. Lee's idea was part of a larger scheme that developed in his mind and I think in his soul shortly after God has thought fit to afflict us most deeply and his chastening hand is not yet stayed, he wrote a priest in Petersburg. We have only to submit to his gracious will and pray for his healing mercy. Then he added, now that the South is willing to have peace, I hope it may be accorded on a permanent basis, that the afflictions and interests of the country may be united and not a forced and hollow truce formed. To this end, all good men should labor. So how precisely would he labor for that end? Some wanted his name alone to promote their businesses. Others wanted his memoirs, others for him to lead their schools. He rejected all until the trustees of a devastated little school in Lexington made him an offer attractive enough for him to seek the counsel of clergy. His priest friend tried to interest him in what the priest later called more conspicuous schools. But soon Lee argued that this door and not another was opened to him by Providence, and Lee wanted assurance that he was competent to do the job so that his remaining years would be, the priest recalled, a comfort and a blessing to his suffering country. Lee also wanted assurances from the trustees that a layperson accused of treason who could not teach would be acceptable. It was Lee, so of course they said yes. So to Washington College he came. Now, if faculty and trustees expected a figurehead to adorn their stationery as some businesses craved, they underestimated a man used to commanding tens of thousands, but who had also been superintendent of West Point. He modernized the place after the war with Mexico. And with that background, he quickly took charge of the ravaged school and began again to innovate. Rather than replacing the old classical curriculum of ancient languages and literature, he built upon it to suit the needs of post-war America. Engineering, mining, agriculture, business, journalism, law, modern history and languages, including, get this, English, what a radical idea. All these and more he incorporated as areas for learning. Why? So that graduates could return to their homes as well-trained, productive citizens able to restore prosperity to the South and beyond, and thus promote peace and reunion to accord with God's healing mercy. His goal was exalted and utterly pragmatic. First, for the school. He bluntly told the faculty that if students couldn't find what they were looking for at Washington College, they would go elsewhere. It was pragmatic as well for a region to rebuild and a nation to reunite, to train young people to do just that. For Lee, such training involved more than educating the mind. He believed that character was just as important as practical skills. And on improving the state of student souls, he agreed completely with the pre-existing faculty and trustees of Washington College. For decades, students had to attend daily chapel, Monday through Saturday, first and now what we call Washington Hall, and then in the hyphen between that and Robinson. I hope you can see that, between basically the two large buildings on the right. Lee only changed the custom by having local clergy of every denomination, rather than just Presbyterian, rotate in leading services. Well, did his plan work? Students voted with feet that led them here in ever-growing numbers. Nearly 150 in Lee's first year, when many a Southern university couldn't open at all. More came than the little chapel could hold. So in June, Lee tersely reported, "A larger chapel is much needed. The room used is too small and badly adapted to the purpose. It is, moreover, required for additional lecture rooms into which it could be conveniently converted." Well, what Lee wanted, Lee got. The trustees authorized $10,000 to build a separate chapel. Far too little, they quickly realized, but they could save money by doing the job of designing it by shopping it off to local talent. And local talent was right next door. Thomas Holmes Williamson at VMI was one of the first to teach architecture as an academic discipline. His assistant, George Washington Custis Lee, you might note the name, held an interest in the topic as well, and he also owned a book by which to pattern a building, which was often the way that American buildings were built and designed. They and Lee Sr. drew up a plan. Work started, and the plan looks like this. You can even see Lee's notation if you look very carefully. Work started on the first college building, constructed by all free labor. By 1868, it was done, barely in time for commencement, and dedicated on June 14th, 1868. It became then the gathering place of the college, first for worship. Lee attended services each day, sitting right over there. Because he came, everybody else did too, not because they had to anymore, but because they chose to, at least for a while. As a place of prayer for all people, clergy from every denomination in town led services so that each student could worship in his own tradition, so long as it was Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian, or Baptist. Roman Catholics hadn't come yet. If they had, I dare say they would have been included too. As well, it housed academic gatherings, the student literary societies, and also the so-called Ugly Club, which I will let you imagine for yourselves. Lee moved his office to downstairs and the treasurer's, making it an administrative center as well. The YMCA also met in the basement, so this became at least something of a student union alongside everything else. The building became the college's meeting place. Now, I believe that June 1868 marked the apex of Lee's presidency. Faculty numbers had mushroomed along with student enrollment, with 111 students from North as well as South, and even some from other countries. Washington College ranked as the second largest academic institution in the entire South, exceeded only by that school which shall not be named on the other side of Afton Mountain. It had 475. Harvard and Yale colleges had only about 100 undergraduates more. So Washington College was a pretty big deal. And then began the long decline. That fall of 1868, Lee's health began to falter. His further dreams didn't go as well met as his earlier ones. He got crotchety, breaking his rule to say nothing public about public affairs. After the post-war rush to school, enrollment here as elsewhere fell off, not to rebound until the next century. Lee died 148 years ago this Friday. Faculty and trustees invited Mrs. Lee to place his remains in the chapel basement. She agreed. Pendleton led his funeral from this lectern, and then Lee's body in civilian clothes was interred downstairs, just off his office, which the college mandated to remain forever as it was as he left it. On Lee's next birthday, January 19, Jubal Early, as I mentioned, spoke here of Lee as general, as the lost cause mythology began to take shape. The idea of a statue also emerged, Mrs. Lee chose Edward Valentine to sculpt a monument depicting him in uniform on the battlefield. She died, then their daughter Agnes, so that the basement was turning into a mausoleum and the building slowly becoming more and more a memorial. With the completion in 1883 of the statue and its chamber, the mausoleum, and of course his office, the building became not just a college meeting place, but also a memorial to Lee, primarily General Lee. Trustees memorialized Lee in another way. Unable to hold on to Robert Lee himself, they did the next best thing. They made his son, who helped design this place, as president, and held on to him as long as they could, whether he wanted to stay or not, and he really didn't. The college continued its downward spiral. Regular worship here in this building died off altogether by the turn of the century, never permanently to return. When William Lyon Wilson, Grover Cleveland's Postmaster General, tried to revive the college as its first president in 30-plus years, not named Lee, he used what was by then called the Memorial Chapel, or sometimes even Lee Memorial Chapel, for the entire community to ponder major issues of the day. He noticed, however, that the people of Lexington and other friends of the university are deeply affected with Lee worship. He died after just a few years. I don't think there's any connection between his statement and his death, but there we are. On January 1907, this chapel became the focal point for the centennial of Lee's birth. The speaker, Charles Francis Adams, New England descendant of two presidents, a wartime Yankee brevet general, lauded Lee as military commander, as Christian character, as college president. He shocked the chapel's largest crowd since Lee's funeral by declaring that had he had to choose in 1861 between North and South as Lee did, he would have done as Lee had done. That day, for the first time on record, Confederate flags appeared alongside U.S. and Virginia banners inside the chapel. And they betoken, as indeed that occasion represents, two new developing trends for the chapel's meaning. It became more Confederate. It also became more American, each precisely because of its relationship with Lee. Trend one. In becoming more about Lee, it became more Confederate. Already from the 1890s, at the latest, Lexington, the so-called Mecca of the South, housed here the Shrine of the South. Soon, postcards proclaimed the chapel as the Westminster Abbey of the Confederacy. Not everything was quite so solemn, as you can see. Well, and that became an issue. How broadly will it serve the community, the chapel, the college community? Well, there were other issues. Dealing with the chapel's very structure prompted ideas of making it grander. To be sure, the building was in terrible shape. College authorities feared it would explode in flames from the result of tourists smoking their cigarettes as they toured the place. Can you imagine? But also, tastes had come to reject Victorian Romanesque styles in favor of neo-colonial white columns and pediments as on the colonnade. This, what they thought was a poorly constructed pile of bricks, failed, moreover, to do justice to the great Robert E. Lee. And, practically speaking, no longer could the college community all gather in Lee's old chapel. The place had grown, the college had grown. With these concerns, the new young president, Henry Louis Smith, conspired with the university architect and alumnus B.C. Flournoy, who had already produced the Lexington Post Office and Doremus Gymnasium, which you see. And they wanted to create something larger, something more coherent with the colonnade, above all, something more fitting for a personage as exalted and sublime as Lee. Renovation, they called it publicly, but they really meant tearing everything down except what Smith defined as the Lee Shrine, the statue chamber, the mausoleum, and the office, and replace it with a grand and glorious temple. The first scheme shows a rotunda, sort of like you know where with columns galore outside and inside, so everyone could fit under one dome in the site of the recumbent statue. Of course, under that scheme, and many of the others that would follow, nothing would remain of what Lee built. Having earlier obtained the commitment of the Virginia United Daughters of the Confederacy to provide a custodian, as she was called, Smith then persuaded the national UDC to support his so-called renovation. But word leaked out of what he really meant. In early 1922, Lexington's Mary Lee Custis chapter of the UDC sounded the alarm. Matthew W. Paxton, editor of the Rockbridge County News, took it up in print, and the news went, as we would now say, viral. All over the country, UDC members joined alumni in protest. Though Smith persuaded the national UDC to hold firm against this rebellion, he soon sent Flournoy in a different direction, most of which would retain the old chapel while adding on a huge auditorium. Now here you see one of his earlier sketches, one that really got to, it was held in great secrecy, so the local UDC didn't see it, but they could use their imaginations, and this is the sort of thing they feared. And then a later one, which you can see this chapel chamber, the statue chamber is on this floor plan at the very top of what you see there. Well, that continued. And so then the idea became one of extending the chapel with a large auditorium that, as Lucy says, extends almost to Jefferson Street, but also to revise the grounds so that we also have a mounted statue of General Lee, and for that we can imagine what's in Richmond right now. So and so here, by about 1923, Flournoy had come up with something that added on this huge auditorium, and it may be very hard to see, but in the pediment that faces you there, you might be able to see the figures of two Confederate uniformed sentries guarding the doorways. Also notice that the chapel remains mostly, but not the tower. Smith really didn't like that. And so what we have instead, as you see, is really quite grand and glorious. In October, the New York Times displayed this latest sketch and describing it as a gift of the UDC, the tribute of Southern womanhood to the South's ideal hero. It cited approvals of National Fine Arts Commissions, and the National UDC endorsed it once again. But by Christmas, editorials, alumni, politicians, celebrity artists all condemned the plan. And so on Lee's birthday in 1924, Smith and the trustees conceded. The chapel would remain intact. Still, as in 1866, the school needed a place for everyone to assemble. So Flournoy produced a separate memorial auditorium plan, looking on the outside like Doremus, but inside like this. Notice the 3 times life-size statue of Lee, whether in uniform, academic gown, or both is hard to tell. There wasn't enough money, or maybe enough chutzpah, to build it. Instead, they made some improvements and created the first museum downstairs. Someone who had attended Adams' 1907 talk proposed adding Confederate flags, which appeared permanently in 1930. All these ideas, successful, or whoops, I think I got ahead of myself here. There we go. There we go. You can see the flags, and also the salutes of the VMI cadets as they would walk by. This occurred until relatively recently. So all of these ideas, successful or not, fostered this first trend, this Confederate link. So meanwhile, Trend 2 emerged, and both of these in some ways reflected national dynamics. Adams's fellow Massachusetts blue blood, Gamaliel Bradford, descended from the Bradfords of Plymouth, in 1913 published the first Lee biography by a Northerner. The title is significant, Lee the American. 2 years later, Douglas Southall Freeman began his magisterial biography, which appeared 2 decades later and won a Pulitzer Prize. They and others placed Lee on a national stage. Around the same time, downstairs in the museum created by exhibitions that focused not only on the Civil War, but also on all American conflicts, not to mention having Traveler there too. So then, when the university won the attention of the funding of the Ford Motor Company Foundation for a much-needed and this time genuine renovation, the grant of $370,000 resulted from Lee's national stature. The fund's vice president called Lee loved and respected by all Americans. Tellingly, he stressed Lee's quoting him, the dedication to the education of youth after he had suffered the sorrow and agony of military defeat, on which exemplifies the American ideal of responsible citizenship. Wholesale renovation of chapel and museum followed. For added measure, in 1961, the U.S. Department of the Interior declared Lee Chapel a National Historic Landmark. Fast forward another 3 decades. On this same occasion in 1995, I'm wrong on the date up there, it was 95, the preeminent Civil War historian Bud Robertson inimitably lauded the character of Lee. I remember it, I was sitting right up there. He was talking of questions that were arising, but declared, because the mountain is a mystery when one looks only at the lowlands, we appear incapable of viewing the heights, and that is sad, not for Lee, but for us. He concluded, it was because of Lee that modern America exists at all. But it was University President John Elrod who, in introducing Robertson, in retrospect, I believe, charted the future for how Lee would be understood, at least here. He called Lee the modern founder of this institution and a pioneer in education who moved beyond an understanding of knowledge as valuable in itself to be as well a means for improving the human condition. 2 years later, as the chapel underwent another renovation, and by now the university was keeping up maintenance very, very well, which it has continued to do, the idea of Lee as educator shaped the museum's exhibits downstairs. The restored Du Bois portrait on your right of Lee in civilian clothing took pride of place. Again, in 2007, on the bicentennial of Lee's birth and the quadricentennial of Virginia's founding, the museum broadened and yet sharpened its focus on the contributions of this school and it to education by Washington as well as Lee. The chapel, over its century and a half, has meant many things to many people. Now, as controversy swirls around Lee, it questions understandings of the chapel as well. I suggest that looking to its origins in 1868 might bring at least some clarity or perhaps a little reflection to the contention. First, to call the man President Lee instead of General Lee is right and proper, for educator is the role that Lexington knew him. And what an educator he became. Had he lived just a few years longer, we might rank him among the most forward-looking and usually vastly younger university leaders of the era. As for the chapel, this has been the steadily growing emphasis for nearly a quarter century at least, seen most clearly in the museum, but also in the statue chamber, which, with removing the Confederate flags in 2014, restored it to how it more appeared on the day of its dedication in 1883. Second, in coming here, Lee left the war behind him and wanted to put it behind the nation. To that end, all good men should labor, he wrote. He labored for that end primarily as college president, but especially in the years culminating with the chapel's dedication. He labored as well by urging his colleagues in war to remain in the country to work for peace, to reduce tensions, to avoid building monuments to the war which he feared would only re-inflame or perpetuate passions. And though he held the then standard racial views of whites toward non-whites, which we should rightly reject, he also advocated justice and education for all, regardless of race. He, who had already been the only general in history to be offered command of two opposing armies, also became one of the very few who, having led his forces in defeat in a bitter civil war, turned to being the paramount voice for peace and reconciliation afterward. The chapel reflects his values, or it can. Whereas enslaved workers built the colonnade, free labor constructed this chapel. It invited, not mandated, worship, and that worship was inclusive of every denomination then known to Lexington. It brought people together, town as well as gown, for every sort of occasion, and did so by the all too limited standards of the day, without discrimination. Over the decades, it has, for many, nurtured character and integrity. What then can the chapel symbolize in our own day? It no longer serves for regular worship. It may not inspire students and faculty as once it did. It certainly no longer claims to be the shrine of the South, and given its origins, perhaps never should have been. But somehow, in our fractious era, Lee's initial hopes for the chapel seem all the more needed. A place for calm reflection, for reconciliation, for exploration of our deepest values and hopes and dreams, for coming together to share joys and sometimes sorrows, for the upbuilding of the mind and the development of the soul and of personal character of men and women who can go forth from this place to promote both prosperity and also a deepened sense of unity in our land and in our world. For that, this chapel can be, as in some ways it has always been, both a symbol and a location where those values can become real. Somehow, I think that is as worthy a purpose as it was 150 years ago. Thank you. We have time for some questions. Lucy has a microphone, but if I want to make sure that everyone hears.
Let me explain a little
Yes.
bit. We do have a few minutes if you'd like to ask David some questions.
I've always wanted to hold a microphone the way Bruce Springsteen does. The notion of reconciliation that Lee stood for, which was very real for him, seems to have been lost in the years after. Was it ever bubbling below the surface during those years, or was it really set aside for other mythologies and other ulterior motives?
Thank you. The question, could you all hear the question? It concerns how deeply held the spirit of reconciliation that I'm attributing to Lee was held. I think that's a very good question, and it's contradicted by what Nathan Bedford Forrest was doing at the same time. So how deeply, how widely was it held? That's a very good question. I would argue that Lee and Grant were the primary proponents of that, and it emanates out of Appomattox. And that the frustration of each was that it was not followed through for all kinds of reasons. And that both of them ended up being rather frustrated by that, and it emerged for each of them in some sometimes quirky and even unfortunate ways. But that there was this dream. And it also, again, it accords with what I've tried to define as Lee's religious sensibility, his sense of mission in coming here. He did not side with the South for any apparent religious or theological reason, but he did come here perceiving that this was a mission from God. And that presents a different dynamic. So, a good question that I really can't answer, but it's I think a very legitimate one for us to ponder. I think we also might wish that it had been more appreciated and lived out. Ours would be a much more united nation if it had been.
Hi. Hi. When you started writing the book, Charlottesville hadn't happened. How did the events in Charlottesville affect your writing? Did you find yourself going back and revisiting certain chapters? Was it weighing on you?
Oh yes. The question has to do with the effect of Charlottesville on my writing. It meant that this book was in some measure rewritten, that in Charleston before it, and it certainly weighed on me in this book as well. It could not help but do so. I guess this one was out. It was Charleston that affected that one, and then Charlottesville this one. And one of my personal reactions to Charlottesville was that we saw many of the tensions and reactions that Lee would abhor. In many ways, it was not about Lee. I mean, let me come clean. I went to that school over there. And the idea of people walking along the steps of the rotunda shouting, "Jews shall not replace us," has absolutely nothing to do with Robert E. Lee, and he would disavow that in a moment. We're dealing with very complicated days and complicated histories. because by siding with the South, there is no question, he sided, even though he personally opposed slavery and secession, he nevertheless fought valiantly in order to preserve it. Although ironically, at the end of the war, he was talking with Jefferson Davis about emancipating the slaves so that they could fight for Southern independence. It's complicated, and it's often very hard to summarize those complications in a way that people can readily understand.
Hello, sir. My name is Rafe, and I'm a freshman at Washington and Lee right now. And my question is very simply this, that you mentioned a lot about Robert E. Lee working for reconciliation and peace after the Civil War in his time as president. Yet, till today, I can quote some of my hallmates telling me that they do not like to come to this place because it reminds them of the horrors that their ancestors had to go through. And as the way I see it, it feels like this building is becoming a source of increasing division on this campus. So is there anything that you'd suggest can solve that? Because clearly we've seen that even with the commission that was set up 1 year ago and the findings that it brought out, nobody really seems satisfied, and rightly so.
Well, I'm not going to comment at all about the commission itself. I do think that, I'd like to think that what I have written might contribute toward a deeper understanding of Lee, for better and for worse. I will also point out that the chapel has gone through a number of iterations over the decades. For example, oops, it's gone. You might have seen the Westminster Abbey of the Confederacy. It did have curtains that separated, that could be closed so that Lee is not seen, and there was some concern in the commission report of things like that. The use of portraits, certainly the removal of flags. But the other thing too is that I do see, as sort of historian and neighbor, I do see the commission's report as part of a longer continuum that began at least 25 years ago, that continues to stress Lee's role as educator. And in so doing, it does implicitly distinguish that second act of his life from the first. He came here very clearly not as a military person. And he never disavowed the Confederacy, but he also sought not to perpetuate that. So I would hope that perhaps looking at the person as an entirety, for better and for worse. We're also dealing with a very deep issue that in many ways we've been dealing with in a number of areas. How can people make positive contributions to our progress as a nation who are themselves deeply flawed? At the University of Virginia, there are serious questions about Thomas Jefferson, who founded the university. So, I mean, I really do appreciate your question. I don't have any easy answers. The easier one would say, buy both the books and read them, but I won't do that. Dr. Bushell.
First, thank you. Thank you so much, first, for your work and for this wonderful lecture. And I'm just curious, if Washington College had not been located in Lee's native Virginia, do you think he would have accepted the invitation, and how would history have been changed?
Nah, not a chance. I don't see any reason why he would. His home was here. He also had some interesting connections with the college. First of all, his wife was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington and the granddaughter by adoption of George Washington. His father had sent his half-brother Henry to Washington College for a year. And his father also had been one to advise George Washington on making the very munificent grant to the Liberty Hall Academy, as a result of which they changed the name to Washington College. So for some reason, this place struck him in a way that others did not. And the fact that it was down and out, I mean, I think we can realistically say he saved the college. It was on its last legs. And there was something about that really grabbed his attention and arguably even his soul in a way that some of these other places did not. He had his pick, and he chose here. Yes, ma'am, over here.
As a follow-up to what you just said, I just wanted to kind of say what you just said, that you think that he actually saved the place. I mean, to me, that's the impression, that this school had lost its students, had lost its faculty, had lost its money, and everything else. And I think that, you know, something that today's students should at least appreciate is they wouldn't be here today studying in this university if Robert E. Lee had not been the man you have described to all of us and had helped to, you know, let this university or college at the time survive. And also, even the legal department, if I remember correctly, wasn't he the one who actually brought the legal department into the university?
The law school was yes.
So those people who are law students
Yeah.
today wouldn't have a law
Yeah.
school to come to had it not been for Robert E. Lee.
Well, of course, we don't know what might have been had he not come. We do know that when he came in 1865, it was a god-awful mess. And in 1868, it was the second largest in the South. And even then, that doesn't even capture some of the dreams that he had. He had hoped to create a scientific school as part of it that would allow Southerners to go to a place to really study their science and engineering and so forth, instead of having to go to West Point or Harvard or Yale or Cornell, other major northern institutions. There is a story that I would love to be true, and I don't know that it is, but it's something that I picked up in a history of Virginia Tech that said that Lee and people over at VMI were thinking about creating some sort of agricultural school. And this school would not only have day classes, but night classes so that average working people could go. And it would be open to men and women without regard to race. Someday I'll have to get down to Tech and check out what his sources are, but wouldn't that have been spectacular had it occurred? So, thank you. Last question.
I'm trying for a gentleman's C in this class.
The exam will come later.
Between 1865 and 1870, was there any other educator in America that you or anybody else in this room knows who was thinking and doing what Lee was doing? Because most of the transition in American education came after 1875, I think.
Well, actually, it began before that. I'm glad you asked that. And yes, there indeed were. There was somebody like Charles Eliot Norton at Harvard, who comes in 1869, and he, in his inaugural address, he starts saying some of the things that Lee has been doing. I don't remember the names, but I believe it's the president of Dartmouth, the president of Cornell. There's a number of educators, all of whom tend to be Northerners, and all of whom are young. I mean, Norton was in Harvard for I don't know how many decades. So they lasted a long time, and in the process they transformed American higher education. But they did so in a way that, whether they realized it or not, and I bet they didn't, were emulating what Lee had already begun to do here. And that's why I argue that had he become better known as an educator, had he lasted longer, had he been able to create some of these additional innovations, I think we would look at him quite differently. And truly not just as a military hero, for better or worse, obviously, but an educator in a way that is very much for good.
But he'd already been speaking in the North to raise funds.
Oh yeah, oh sure. Sure, and he got lots of support, as you know, from Cyrus McCormick and George Peabody and others. So there was that. People were attracted to what he was doing, both donors as well as students. So it's an interesting saga. I gather that there are some books being written about that, and thank goodness I don't have to then. So, again, my thanks for all of you for being here, and I wish you all well.